Mom whispered, "If you die, your sister gets the house," right before my surgery. I woke up, listened to 70 voicemails, then took everything back. They thought the story would end with my death. They never imagined I'd survive, with the deed, the scar, and a plan they never saw coming. Stay with me, this is where it turns. As the anesthesia began to cloud my vision, right before they wheeled me into the operating room, my mother leaned over and took my hand as if she were the distraught matriarch in an off-Broadway play. In that syrupy sweet voice she saved for funerals and fundraising dinners, she remarked, "If you don't make it, at least your sister gets the house." Her breath had a subtle scent of mint tea and guilt. I avoided arguing, flinching, and even making eye contact with her. Like any good daughter, I simply nodded, but not for the reason Mother believed. A machine beeps continuously next to me, and I woke up 2 days later in a hospital room that smelled like bleach and resignation. A steady ache pressed down on my chest like a toddler sitting there, reminding me that I had survived. I did really well, the nurse said. The physicians were impressed. I had good vitals. In contrast, my sister hadn't even bothered to arrive, and my mother had already left for her afternoon bridge session. I wasn't thinking about God, second chances, or even what happens after death as I lay there and stared up at those ceiling tiles that were patterned like dull snowflakes. That house was on my mind. The home of my father. The magnolia tree that flowered late every spring no matter what, and the one with the crumbling stone walkway. He constructed it by hand in the late 1970s, hauling boards up that hill each weekend while Evelyn remained in the city, too preoccupied with committees and cocktails to give a damn. I should have had that house as soon as he left. For years though, the deed hung over my head like a poker chip, held by my mother Evelyn, who always behaved more like a real estate salesperson than a parent, with insignificant remarks like, "Well, if you ever settle down," or "Nicole has more space in her apartment, maybe we give her a wing." Nicole. The golden girl who was unable to manage a mortgage, much less caring for a plant. I had previously altered the will, which is the problem. I called Greg a few weeks prior to the procedure when the cardiologist began discussing percentages and unforeseen issues. Greg has been both my friend and my lawyer since college. On a soggy Thursday, we sat in his office, and I signed each form with steady hands. I left the house for someone none of them would have anticipated, not Nicole or Evelyn. They believed I wouldn't be strong enough to fight. They believed they would ultimately prevail if I had the procedure. Evelyn, grinning smugly. Nicole daydreams about her fortune. They believed that the story would finish with death. However, I had spent years organizing this chapter. I hit the nurse call button because I wanted someone to make sure I was still alive, breathing, and in control, not because I needed anything. I asked if she might pass my phone to me as she entered, her hands delicate and her expression pleasant. It sat on the window ledge in a small plastic bucket, its screen flickering like a desperate lighthouse every few seconds. Voicemails were left. A lot of voicemails. Evelyn, who was brisk and emotionless, asked when I would be released so she could arrange her calendar. That was the first 10. Nicole sent me the next several, which were all sugar and syrup, asking how I was doing, if I needed anything, and if she could take over some of the duties while I healed. Translation: allow me to sniff around the filing cabinet and take a look at your documents. However, voicemail number 23 was the culprit. It was the one that caused me to hesitate. I had to play it again to be certain. In that one, her voice lacked sweetness. It broke. Just a tiny fracture down the middle, nothing major. She said, "You're making a mistake." It was supposed to be mine. Mine was the word that struck me like a second knife. The daughter who never contacted, never assisted with dad's hospice care, and only came to the house for Christmas selfies was the legitimate heir, as if there was a divine inheritance plan written in the stars. I closed my eyes and allowed the message to repeat itself, allowing her desperation to envelop me like a protective layer. It had nothing to do with love. It had never been. Power was at issue here. Concerning control. I was told for years that I was too independent, too irascible, and too angry. However, now, I had the deed now. The papers? The attorney. And I have a huge scar down my chest that proves I've survived them all. Additionally, survival offers you some opportunity to exact revenge. I just needed to wait now. When I first became aware that my mother had a different perspective on us, I was 9 years old. Not merely in passing, but in a manner that would, like a seam in an old shirt, tear a childhood in two. On a July afternoon, Nicole was sitting on the couch with her feet tucked under her, eating a bowl of Neapolitan ice cream, while I was outside cutting the lawn, sweat running down the back of my neck and the mower vibrating through my slender arms. Through the open curtains, I could see her gaze up at me. Without a second thought, She waved, smiled, and returned her attention to the TV. Evelyn responded, "Your sister's delicate. She's not built for this kind of work. You are. You're the tough one." When I questioned her later about why Nicole didn't need to assist. "You're the difficult one" became the catchphrase of my youth, as though taking on responsibility was some perverse form of compensation. I was the one with the wrench when the pipes under the sink burst. I was the one who learned how to clean a feeding tube and endured the chemotherapy when Dad became ill. Evelyn clung to Nicole like she was the widow and I was the hired staff at the funeral, while Nicole drifted in and out with condolence cards and platitudes. As I lay in that hospital bed with brand new staples in my chest, I listened to voicemail after voicemail until they all blended together. Nicole's phony compassion, Evelyn's icy professionalism, and their tolerance gradually eroding. Nicole began to falter around message 20. The pauses grew longer and the words tighter. To be honest, I enjoyed every moment of her cracking. By message number 34, she was completely in a panic. Her words, "This isn't fair," were abrupt. "You don't even live there? You're barely even part of the family anymore. You've been gone for years and now you just take it?" It still hurt to breathe too hard, but I wanted to laugh. Nothing had been taken by me. I had always guarded what was rightfully mine. I hadn't done it by myself either. Greg was the type of guy who could explain legalese without coming across as a patronizing jerk and who remembered birthdays without Facebook reminders. We connected via terrible cafeteria food and awful roommates, met at college freshman orientation, and managed to stay close through heartbreaks, career changes, and everything else in between. He didn't recoil when I called him regarding the will. "Let's make it airtight," he simply said. He created two different trusts, one of which protected the property in my name and the other of which directed the profits from the basement rental unit to a charity shell corporation I had thrown together on a whim years prior. He then put everything in a domestic LLC just for peace of mind. Greg boldly tapped the folder with his pen and remarked, "It's like having 3 houses in one. Or it might have been 4. No, 3, for sure." It was bulletproof, anyway. To reverse Greg's actions, Nicole and Evelyn would require a group of attorneys, a great deal of luck, and perhaps even supernatural intervention. They also weren't particularly renowned for their ability to think strategically or be patient. Evelyn wasn't a lawyer, she was a social tactician. Nicole was also as focused as a moth at a disco ball. Instead of confronting me directly, they attempted to gain access by manipulating me and claiming remorse in the hopes that I would give in to pressure if they left many voicemails. However, they didn't realize how well I knew them. Like in a game of emotional chess, I had studied their moves for years. When Evelyn began using phrases like, "We should talk," I could tell she was losing control. Additionally, Nicole was running out of ways to act as though she didn't have any entitlements when she began to change her voicemail style from sweet to sour in a single message. On a Friday morning, Greg sent the certified letters. They were hand-delivered in substantial envelopes that needed return receipts. One went to Nicole's expensive studio, where she kept her plants alive long enough for Instagram pictures, and the other went to Evelyn's condo uptown. The letters were straightforward. They only served as official notification that the house had been legally transferred and that the trust had revoked any claims against it. Permanent, clean, and cold. The messages began to slow down that night. Less words? More quiet. Once so confident and upbeat, Nicole's voice started to unravel like a ribbon that was tugged too tightly. Message 41 follows. Evelyn was the one. She spoke in a softer tone than usual. Not as well polished, as if she hadn't practiced her speech beforehand. "We ought to speak," she said. "Nicole's condition is not good. She has a special meaning for this house. Don't penalize her for what I said." As if she had finally come to the realization that what she had muttered prior to my operation might have been a bit more than accidental timing, that was the first time she had acknowledged it, her words. As though perhaps, just possibly, she was aware that she had chosen the wrong daughter to underestimate. However, that was too late. With a manila folder on the seat behind me and a level of composure that wasn't appropriate for someone facing a knife, I drove to Greg's office the week before the operation, when I could still walk without someone holding my elbow and breathe without smelling metal. For the first time in months, I wasn't terrified when the warm, low sun shone through the windshield. Not passing away. Not of what followed. The thought of waking up with tubes in my body and discovering nothing had changed frightened me more. The same chilly mom. The same sugar-coated sibling. Where love should have existed, there was the same quiet. When I slid the folder across Greg's desk, he hardly even arched an eyebrow. When I said, "I want to update the will," he gave me the impression that he was anticipating the joke. I continued, seeing the realization fall into his eyes like dust on a shelf that had not been touched in years. And I want them both out of it, I said. Everything he would require was in the folder, including the trust documents, property deeds, and even a copy of the original title to the house, which had my father's handwritten signature at the bottom. I had kept the paper close at hand like a covert weapon, anticipating the moment when I might have to use it. The day had come. Janet, my quiet neighbor who wore orthopedic shoes, talked to her tomatoes, and had more dignity in her pinky toe than my entire family tree combined, was the reason I left the house, not Evelyn or Nicole. When no one else was there, Janet had been. She maintained the garden alive with her own hands, brought in my mail while I was recovering, and once discovered me on the kitchen floor after collapsing. She remained with me until the ambulance arrived and never mentioned the tears I shed that night. Evelyn had never cared to get to know my father the way she had. Until the HOA wrote a letter, Evelyn rolled her eyes and said she was the kind of person who would collect animals and garden gnomes while he talked to her over the fence about soil kinds and storm drains. Unlike them, Janet never made a request. I trusted her with everything because of this. As Greg slipped the updated will into a padded envelope, I said, "Blood isn't always family. Family just bleeds you dry sometimes." He remained silent. Within an hour, he simply nodded and had it notarized. I didn't want to share it with Evelyn or Nicole, not quite yet. Let them believe they were still eligible for whatever remnants of love or legacy they believed my father had left behind. I wished for their comfort. I wanted them to be caught off guard. Because there's something delectable about being 5 steps ahead when you've lived your entire life as the afterthought. Of course, when people start looking for inheritance, secrets don't remain secret for very long. Emotional sabotage had always been Evelyn's forte. Nicole, on the other hand, used sympathy as a weapon as if it were a degree. By midweek, the messages had become sour. Next, the general public. On Facebook, Nicole shared a photo of our house, where we grew up. It was the one where Dad's rusting wind chime was still hanging on the porch and the old oak tree in the front yard was slanting sideways. The caption said, "I've only ever known one home, and my sister is taking it away. Please offer up prayers for our family's harmony." Naturally, I was tagged. 10 common friends were also tagged. Additionally, the comments came in faster than I could read them since everyone enjoys a heartbreaking narrative in cursive font. "Remain resilient, Nicole. You have such courage. Family comes first. I'm hoping you can speak with her. She'll change her mind if you send her a love girl." I didn't answer. I didn't remove my tag. Not even Messenger opened on my end. I was aware of what was waiting there, which was pages upon paragraphs of people who hadn't called in years suddenly behaving as though they were interested in my choice. As if I was too chilly to care and pain and guilt were a 2-for-1 deal. However, I was concerned. Not about them though. Janet called me on her landline that evening. She still has one, yes. She said, "Someone is on my porch." Janet remarked softly, in the same level voice she used when the neighbor's dog was struck by a delivery van, "She's not crying. She is yelling." I didn't need to inquire about its identity. Even across the street, I could hear her over the receiver, her voice trembling on the brink of despair and anger. "She is shouting your name," Janet said. What ought I to do? With the lights off, I gazed out my kitchen window and saw my sister's figure thrashing on Janet's porch, her arms whirling like shattered windshield wipers and her voice hitting pitches that ought to have been marked with a warning sign. "Nothing," I answered, sounding more composed than I actually was. "Allow her to scream." 2 days after the porch incident, Janet delivered the mail by hand, wearing the same stern look she used when she argued with cable repairmen or defended the right way to grow hydrangeas. My name was written in her exquisite script on a thick white envelope. Rachel. Not Rach. No, dear. Not a moniker that attempted to mitigate malice. Only Rachel. That alone convinced me that this was neither drama nor gossip. It was a heavier object. 2 pages of the mail were folded exactly in thirds, and a photograph dropped out and fell face down on the counter. I started by reading the letter. The words, which Janet had handwritten, oozed through the lines as if they had been inside her for too long. She said that she had known for years that something wasn't right but didn't want to get involved. 6 years ago, she said, Evelyn called her once to ask if she felt I was unstable. Janet responded, "No, of course not." Evelyn hung off without saying goodbye, muttering something about me being ungrateful. The fact that Janet had seen Nicole moving money from Evelyn's account, however, was what really got me to sit down at the kitchen table with my heart pounding in that steady, perilous rhythm I had grown all too familiar with. First, little sums. $50 here, $100 there, then larger ones. Enough to be noticed, enough to cause pain. Janet didn't pry. She simply became aware of something. When Evelyn's arthritis flare-up, she occasionally assisted her with internet banking. Even though the withdrawal was recorded as medical costs, Nicole said she was present on the day Evelyn promised her money for a new car. Evelyn knew, according to Janet. "Well, Nicole needs it more than I do," she responded after taking a quick glance at the transaction history. She then poured herself another glass of wine and shifted the conversation to whether the area should adopt a new gate code. "Rachel has always been self-sufficient." I turned the picture over and looked at it for a long time. Nicole was standing in front of a dealership, perhaps 5 years ago, holding keys in one hand and wearing a smile that stopped short of her eyes. Beside her, Evelyn was carrying a check. The name of the dealership may be seen in the backdrop. The date scribbled on the back seemed familiar to me. It coincided with the week Nicole told me she had independently saved money for her first car. I should have been astonished, perhaps even devastated. Mostly, though, I felt worn out, as if someone had finally drained the pool after I had been swimming through molasses for years. I listened to the voicemails again until I reached number 66. It was only a dozen seconds long. "Please, Rach," pleaded Nicole in a hoarse, desperate voice. "I was unaware of your seriousness. Just speak to me, please." After pausing, I clicked reply. I invited them over to the house for coffee. I will give them credit for making a daring move. Both of them arrived on schedule, dressed as though they had just left a church service. Hair coiled, pearls on the neck. Like a specter from my early years, Evelyn's unpleasant aroma filled the hallway. Even though Nicole appeared exhausted, her shoes were still clicking too loudly on the hardwood. Evelyn also brought foil-wrapped lemon bars, as if this were a reconciliation potluck. I poured them both coffee without asking how they were feeling, and we sat in the sunroom, which my father had constructed with his bare hands before his arthritis took over. For a full minute, no one spoke. Evelyn then let the floods come. With a composed and rehearsed voice, she started, "I think emotions got the best of all of us. Perhaps it's time to talk about a different arrangement. One that is equitable, just that term." As if I had taken something that had once been theirs. Nicole gazed at her cup as if it were a window into the future. Her eyes were glassy as she whispered, "Dad would have wanted me to have it. It would have been mine. Once, when I was 16, Dad told me that." I refrained from arguing. I didn't speak louder. I just took out the photo and the copy of the bank ledger that Greg had printed for me that morning by reaching into the folder that was resting on the seat cushion next to me. They sat nicely between them after I moved them both across the table. I looked into each of their eyes and remarked, "Funny, since Dad had stated otherwise." In text. Healing is always discussed as though it were an uphill trek, with one steady foot in front of the other, and that once you reach the top, you feel complete again. In actuality, though, there are days when it feels more like you're sitting at the bottom of a drained pool, rubbing your hands across a cracked tile, and wondering whether you ever imagine the water. To be honest, I never thought I would feel pleased with myself for excluding them. I didn't anticipate feeling triumphant. However, I also didn't anticipate feeling this weighty peace, as if my bones had finally stopped vibrating from trying so hard to win over people who would never applaud me. After that coffee meetup, the calls couldn't stop. Until the letter finally arrived at the courthouse at the end of that week. Nicole sounded like she was playing sadness on a stage where only I could cheer, and her voice messages started off in the same over-perfumed manner. At one point, she said, "You're being dramatic. You're making things more difficult than they need to be." However, it changed rapidly. There was shouting after message 32. I'm swearing. She tried to push her brittle voice into my ear while yelling about injustice, betrayal, and what our father would have wanted. It sounded as though she had something in the car that he would never have signed a check for if he had known. Nicole's voice had become desperate by the time we reached message 70. "Mom isn't doing well," she muttered. I briefly stopped the recording because I was experiencing an unidentified sensation in my chest. However, it went away, much like a pain you ignore for a while until it becomes a part of your own body's background hum. It was ironic that Evelyn had ended up in the hospital following what they described as a small stroke, given that she had used words as weapons for the most of her life and was now unable to create half of them. Greg answered the questions. The cease and desist threats are passive-aggressive. Nicole made ridiculously baseless claims of elder abuse to get past a new lawyer who obviously didn't know what he was getting himself into. Janet, meantime, moved into the ground floor guest room without discussing rent or a timeline. As if she had always been there, she simply showed up one morning carrying her old kettle and a bag of supplies. I hadn't asked, but she began by clearing away the old garden beds. With a kind of grace that made my chest tight, I watched from the window as she chopped the dead things down to their roots and tossed them into a wheelbarrow. When I was strong enough, I finally joined her, And we replaced the withering flowers with lavender. Lavender is more durable. It defends itself. Several days a week Tyler, the adolescent neighbor who skateboarded up and down the block like it was a runway, began to show up. He wasn't asked to. After making a single knock and displaying a pair of gloves that were obviously not his, he added, "Janet said you're regrowing stuff. You need help." Hands in the soil, trying not to think too much, simply doing something that felt real, he reminded me of myself as a child. I once wrote Nicole a reply. One restless night at around 3 a.m, I typed it out on a notes app. Suddenly I thought I could be swallowed whole by the stillness. Nothing was sugar-coated by me. I told her everything I knew, what I had always known, about Janet, and about the automobile. I informed her that I was simply exhausted and no longer upset. With my thumb poised over send, I gazed at the message for a while before deleting it. The next morning came message number 104. Now her voice was no more than a whisper. "Please," she said. "Just one conversation. I miss my sister." I didn't even finish playing it. When I hit delete, I only saw the tiny blue dot go. Later that day, I watched Tyler water the fresh row of marigolds we had planted between the tomatoes and the herbs in the garden. The porch I had previously scrubbed for a mother who never expressed gratitude was bathed in a warm, golden glow as the sun perfectly illuminated the side of the home. I also came to a realization I had been reluctant to share. The house was not something I regretted retaining. I had no regrets about the silence, the will, or the trust. I wished I hadn't waited so long to claim it as mine. The problem with surviving, I suppose, is that people think you're the same person. But on that table, I kind of died. Thanks for watching and sticking around till the end. If you enjoyed these stories, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss the next drama-filled episode.